Imagine an empire so massive that it didn't just conquer nations, it engulfed 30 modern countries. If this empire existed today, it would rule over 3 billion people. It would control everything from the high-tech streets of Seoul, across the oil fields of the Caspian, all the way to the historic gates of Warsaw, Poland. It was a terrifying superpower that reshaped the literal geology of our planet, erasing entire civilizations from history and creating a trade network that laid the foundations for our modern global economy. But its story does not begin with a massive army. It does not start with towering castle walls, sophisticated technology, or vast treasures. It starts with a single starving kid, a boy abandoned by his own tribe, left to die on the frozen Asian steppe with nothing but his mother and siblings. He had no food, no allies, no wealth, and absolutely no future. How did a boy who hunted rodents just to stay alive grow up to become Genghis Khan, the builder of the largest continuous land empire in human history? The answer is not just a story of blood and conquest. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare, terrifying engineering, and a societal blueprint so revolutionary it shattered the medieval world forever. Let's find out.
To understand the rise of the Mongol Empire, we must first understand the brutal crucible that created it. In the late 12th century, there was no such thing as Mongolia. Instead, the vast, unforgiving, high-altitude plains of East Asia were a chaotic battleground. Dozens of nomadic tribes, the Tartars, the Khanates, the Merkits, the Naimans, and the Mongols were locked in a permanent, generational cycle of blood feuds. Kidnapping, murder, betrayal, and slavery were not just common occurrences, they were a way of life. The environment itself was a killer, with winter temperatures plunging to a lethal -40 degrees. In the year 1162, a boy was born into this chaos. His name was Temujin. Legend says he emerged from his mother's womb clutching a blood clot the size of a knuckle bone in his tiny right hand. To the nomadic shamans, this was an omen. The boy was destined to be a killer. But destiny did not protect him from the brutality of the steppe. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father, a minor tribal chieftain, was ruthlessly poisoned by a rival Tartar faction while traveling. Expecting his father's followers to protect the young family, Temujin's family was instead betrayed. The clan elders decided that a widow and her young children were dead weight. They stripped Temujin's family of their livestock, packed up their tents, and rode away, abandoning them to freeze to death on the plains. This is where the psychological blueprint of the future world conqueror was forged. Temujin, his mother Hoylun, and his siblings survived by digging up wild roots, gathering bitter plants, and hunting small rodents. In this desperate fight for survival, internal friction boiled over. When Temujin's older half-brother, Bekter, began stealing the meager food Temujin and his brother Kasar hunted, the teenage Temujin reached his breaking point. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he acted with absolute, calculated finality. Temujin and Kasar stalked Bekter through the tall grass. As Bekter sat alone on a hill, the two brothers stepped out from the brush, bows drawn. Bekter didn't beg for mercy. He knew the law of the steppe. They loosed their arrows, killing him instantly. At just 14 years old, Temujin had crossed a line. He had learned that in a world of absolute chaos, survival required absolute ruthlessness. Shortly after, a rival tribe captured Temujin, locking his neck into a heavy wooden yoke to parade him around as a slave. But in the dead of night, waiting for the perfect moment of guard carelessness, Temujin used the heavy wooden yoke as a weapon, knocked out his guard, and escaped into a nearby river. He was a ghost. He was unkillable.
As he grew into manhood, Temujin realized that to survive permanently, he could not just be a lone wolf. He needed an army. But instead of relying on the traditional corrupt tribal systems of the steppe, Temujin did something that changed human history forever. For centuries, nomadic tribes were ruled strictly by aristocracy. If you were born the son of a rich chief, you became a general, regardless of how foolish or cowardly you were. Temujin recognized that this nepotism was the reason the tribes were trapped in endless war. When he began attracting his own followers, he completely abolished the old aristocratic privileges. He instituted a strict system of absolute meritocracy. If a warrior was brave, loyal, and brilliant, Temujin promoted him to general, even if he was the son of a poor herder. More shockingly, when Temujin defeated an enemy tribe, he didn't follow the traditional custom of slaughtering the survivors or enslaving them. Instead, he executed the corrupt leaders, pardoned the common warriors, and fully integrated them into his own clan, treating them as equals. By the year 1206, Temujin's revolutionary ideas had done the impossible. He had conquered, unified, or allied every single nomadic tribe on the Mongolian plateau. In the spring of 1206, thousands of leaders gathered at the sacred Kurultai, the Grand Nomadic Council. They planted a massive white banner and proclaimed Temujin as the supreme ruler of the unified steppe. They gave him a new title, a title that would soon strike absolute terror into the hearts of millions across the globe. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Now unified, Genghis Khan commanded an estimated 100,000 highly trained warriors. But to the south and west lay the great settled civilizations of the world, the Jin dynasty of China, the Khwarezmian Empire of Persia, and the principalities of Russia. These empires possessed massive walled cities, millions of citizens, and armies that outnumbered the Mongols 10 to 1. On paper, the Mongols should have been crushed instantly. Instead, they unleashed a military machine so advanced it functioned like a medieval version of Blitzkrieg. The core of this machine was the individual Mongol horse archer. Every single Mongol warrior was raised in the saddle. They could ride for days without stopping, sleeping on horseback while their animals grazed. Each warrior traveled with a string of 4 to 5 horses. When one horse grew tired, the warrior would leap from one saddle to another mid-gallop, allowing the army to move at speeds that baffled their enemies. They could cover 100 miles in a single day, a pace completely unheard of for European or Asian armies of the era. Their primary weapon was the composite recurve bow. Made of layers of birchwood, horn, and sinew, this bow required over 150 pounds of pull to draw, possessing a lethal range of over 300 yards. Because of specialized iron stirrups, a Mongol archer could lean completely off his horse, releasing his arrow at the exact microsecond all 4 of his horse's hooves were off the ground, ensuring a perfectly stable, deadly accurate shot. They wore heavy silk undershirts beneath their leather armor. If an arrow pierced their armor, it didn't tear the silk. Instead, the silk wrapped around the arrow point as it entered the flesh.
This allowed field medics to gently twist and pull the arrow out cleanly without ripping the wound open, preventing lethal infections. But technology was nothing without strategy. The Mongols operated using an ironclad decimal system. The army was divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, known as a tumen. Because they communicated across vast battlefields using smoke signals, flaming arrows, and a highly organized network of mounted messengers, a Mongol army moved like a single, unified organism. Their favorite tactic was the feigned retreat. A small force of Mongols would attack an enemy army, fight poorly for a few minutes, and then turn and flee in apparent panic. The enemy, sensing an easy victory, would break their defensive formations and chase the fleeing Mongols for miles. But this was a trap. The fleeing Mongols were leading them directly into a prearranged kill zone. Suddenly, thousands of fresh Mongol cavalrymen would emerge from the tree lines or hills, completely surrounding the exhausted, disorganized enemy and systematically annihilating them. But what happened when the Mongols encountered walled cities that couldn't be lured into the open field? In China, Genghis Khan faced cities protected by 40-foot-high earthen walls. The nomads had no experience with siege warfare, so Genghis Khan did what any brilliant military mind would do. He adapted. Whenever the Mongols captured enemy engineers, doctors, and scholars, they didn't kill them, they put them on the payroll. Genghis Khan formed an entire corps of Chinese and Persian siege experts. If a city refused to surrender, the Mongols would cut off its food supply, build their own walls around the city to trap the citizens inside, and construct massive trebuchets, catapults, and giant crossbows. They weaponized primitive gunpowder, throwing early explosive bombs over the walls. They filled pots with burning naphtha and oil, launching them into wooden cities to create unstoppable firestorms. If a river flowed near a city, Mongol engineers would literally dam the river and redirect the entire current to wash away the city's foundations. Yet the most potent weapon in the Mongol arsenal wasn't the bow, the horse, or the catapult. It was absolute psychological terror. Genghis Khan calculated that it was far more efficient to make an enemy surrender through fear than to waste time and lives fighting them. He established an unyielding rule of war. If a city surrendered immediately without fighting, their lives were spared, their properties protected, and they were integrated into the empire under low taxes. But if a city resisted, if they killed even a single Mongol soldier or messenger, the punishment was total, unimaginable annihilation. When the wealthy city of Nishapur in Persia revolted and killed Genghis Khan's son-in-law, the Mongol army returned with orders to execute every single living creature. Men, women, children, infants, and even the city's cats and dogs were systematically slaughtered. Their heads were cut off and piled into giant separate pyramids outside the ruined city walls as a gruesome warning to anyone else who dared defy the Khan. Word traveled fast. Entire empires collapsed without a fight because citizens chose to surrender rather than face the Mongol wrath. Genghis Khan didn't need to fight every battle. His reputation fought half of them for him.
This brings us to the great paradox of the Mongol Empire. To history, the Mongols are remembered almost exclusively as bloodthirsty barbarians who left mountains of skulls in their wake. But once the smoke cleared and the conquests were over, the Mongols did something entirely unexpected. They built a golden age of peace, global trade, and human progress. Historians called this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Before the rise of the empire, traveling across Asia and Europe was an incredibly dangerous journey. A merchant would be stopped every few miles by local warlords, taxed heavily, or simply robbed and murdered. The Mongols changed that overnight. By unifying the entire landmass under one single law, they created a massive free trade zone stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. To secure this massive trade network, the Mongols created the world's first universal passport and diplomatic immunity system. It was called a paisa. A paisa was a tablet of gold, silver, or wood worn on a chain around a traveler's neck. It bore an official stamp from the Khan. The message engraved on it was clear: "By the strength of the eternal heaven, whosoever does not respect this passport shall be executed." If a merchant or diplomat wore a gold paisa, they could travel thousands of miles through wild territories, completely unmolested. Local villages along the route were legally required to provide them with food, fresh horses, and armed escorts. Contemporary writers remarked that under Mongol rule, a young woman carrying a golden basin full of wealth could walk from one end of the empire to the other completely untouched. To manage this continental empire, the Khans built the most sophisticated communication network the world had ever seen. It was called the Yam system. Think of it as a medieval, horse-powered internet. The Mongols built post stations spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart across the entire empire. Each station kept hundreds of fresh horses, food supplies, and living quarters. Special royal messengers wore belts lined with bells so that as they approached a station, the attendants could hear them coming from miles away. By the time the messenger arrived, a fresh horse was already saddled and waiting. The messenger would leap onto the new horse and gallop away without ever stepping foot on the ground. Using this system, a message could travel from the capital of Mongolia to the borders of Europe in just a few weeks, a journey that normally took months. It allowed the Khans to monitor rebellions, market prices, and military movements in near real time. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the Mongol peace was their approach to culture and religion. In the 13th century, Europe was tearing itself apart over religious crusades, and Islamic empires were fighting brutal holy wars. The Mongols, however, practiced total religious tolerance. Genghis Khan believed that all religions prayed to the same sky, just in different ways. He exempted all religious leaders, Christian priests, Islam imams, Buddhist monks, and Taoist scholars from paying any taxes. In the Mongol capital of Karakoram, mosques, churches, and temples stood side by side. The Khans regularly hosted massive theological debates where scholars from all over the world argued philosophy while drinking fermented mare's milk. Furthermore, the Mongols were massive fans of globalized knowledge. Because they moved thousands of scholars, doctors, and artisans across their empire, they accidentally kickstarted a global scientific revolution. Chinese printing technology, block printing, and gunpowder traveled west to Europe, laying the foundations for the Renaissance. Persian medicine and astronomy traveled east to China. The modern world was being connected for the very first time, all thanks to the brutal conquests of a nomadic steppe tribe. But an empire built by the sword faces a terminal problem. What happens when there is nothing left to conquer? And more importantly, who rules when the great conqueror dies? In 1227, Genghis Khan died during a campaign in China. His burial place remains one of the greatest mysteries in human history. To ensure his grave would never be disturbed, his funeral escort slaughtered anyone they met on the path to the burial site. They buried him deep in the mountains, then rode 1,000 horses over the grave to erase all tracks, and reportedly diverted a river over the site to hide it forever. To this day, his tomb has never been found. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons initially expanded the empire even further. His grandson, Kublai Khan, conquered all of China and founded the Yuan dynasty, moving the capital to modern-day Beijing. But the empire had grown too massive. It was impossible to govern such vast distances from a single center. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire fractured into 4 independent states known as Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Il Khanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the legendary Golden Horde in Russia. While internal civil wars weakened the Khanates, the ultimate downfall of the Mongol Empire came not from an enemy army, but from an invisible killer. The very trade network that the Mongols had fought so hard to secure became the highway for their destruction. In the 1340s, a lethal bacterium originated in the steppes of Central Asia. Carried by fleas on the backs of rats, the disease hitched a ride along the Silk Road trade caravans and merchant ships protected by the Pax Mongolica. It was the Black Death. The bubonic plague decimated the populations of China, Persia, and Europe, killing up to 60% of the population in some areas. The global trade routes collapsed overnight. The Khanates, isolated from one another and facing massive economic ruin and popular rebellions, began to fall one by one. By 1368, the last Mongol emperor was driven out of China, and the greatest land empire the world had ever seen quietly dissolved back into the dust of the steppe. The Mongol Empire burned hot and fast, lasting as a unified state for less than 2 centuries, but its footprint on our modern world is undeniable. They drew the borders of modern-day nations like Russia and China. They introduced paper money, passports, and globalized trade concepts to the Western world. And genetically, their impact is unparalleled. A famous 2003 genetic study revealed that roughly 8% of men living in the former Mongol Empire region, about 16 million men worldwide, carry a nearly identical Y chromosome that scientists trace back directly to Genghis Khan himself. Genghis Khan and his nomadic horsemen tore down the old medieval world, and in doing so, they violently forced a fractured planet to connect. They were brutal destroyers, enlightened rulers, master strategists, and global visionaries. They built an impossible empire, one that started with a starving boy on the ice and ended by reshaping the face of the earth